So the title of the series that we will be in on Wednesday nights and Sundays is 7 Psalms for Giving Thanks. And so all of the Psalms that we look at will be, our theme for the month will be giving thanks or being grateful. Or we've also obviously got a holiday coming up called Thanksgiving. It is an American holiday. And but obviously, regardless of where we are at, whatever borders we're living within, we want to be people that give thanks. We want to be really people that give thanks to anyone, but especially to God. And so obviously that's what we'll be focusing on. And as we look at these Psalms, and then this will hopefully help us that as we get closer to Thanksgiving, to be in that mindset and to have that heart of gratitude and thanksgiving as we get closer to the actual holiday. So Psalm 18 is where we are at, and this is one of the longest Psalms actually in the book of Psalms out of all 150. In fact, I believe that there are only 2 other Psalms that are longer than this one, and it's fitting the title to this, which we'll look at in just a moment. But let me show you how turn that on. Let me show you how I broke Psalm 18 down. It is focused on the rescuer, and that's going to be David as he's writing this. That's his reason for being thankful, and we'll look at that in just a minute. But you'll see that the first 48 verses I titled Rescuer, and then just the last 2, the result. So we'll look at the result of that. And I have no problem showing you this. Way down in verse 49, you will see that David writes, "Therefore, I will give thanks to you, O Lord." So that really is going to be our theme as we look at this psalm and the other psalms. But you'll see there in verse 49 where David says, "Therefore," all of us being good Bible students, we know that that word "therefore" means whatever we just learned. Therefore, or because of what we just learned, then this is what comes next. This is what comes naturally, and what comes naturally is the giving of thanks. And so you need to keep in mind, we learned some neat things here because we haven't gone through the book of Psalms. We're obviously in the Old Testament on Sunday mornings. Wednesday nights, we've been in the New Testament. We'll continue to keep that pattern, Old Testament. But we're not going to be in Psalms for a long time on Sunday mornings. So this is a neat opportunity for us to look at the Psalms. You do need to keep in mind that these are poetic books. These are songs that are being written by David and actually some other authors. He didn't write all of the Psalms, a large portion of them. But it's poetic. And sometimes the language might kind of throw us off. Sometimes the themes might kind of throw us off. But as we see here in verse 1, and let me go ahead and click over to our first slide, verses 1 through 48, we're going to get the context. So super important whenever you're studying the Bible or really studying anything or having a discussion with someone, context is extremely important. You've got to know what's the main point, what's the main topic, what are we talking about here? Because it's very easy to get distracted or to read something, or even if you're having a discussion with someone, to get off topic if they say something. So you always want to make sure that that as we're studying the Bible specifically, that we know the context, and we learn the context in verse 1. It says here, "To the chief musician, a psalm of David." So in other words, this is a song. That's what psalm means, song of David, the servant of the Lord. Now I love this because it's believed that at this time that he did have that position of being the king. Some of you know the story of David's life story. You know that he was chosen and anointed as king, but it took several years for him to actually assume the throne over Israel. And so it is believed that he was the king at this time, and yet he doesn't refer to himself as king at all. At the end of the psalm, we will see him refer to himself as king. But here he says, "I'm just a servant of the Lord." Because whether you were a king or a pauper, a king or a servant, you're still, if you belong to the Lord, then you're simply a servant of the Lord. And really, That's the best position that we could ever hope to attain to, is just to be the servant of the Lord. That's all I want to do, is serve the Lord. So he says, a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who spoke to the Lord. So we know that this is written to the Lord. The words of this song, on the day, here's the context, on the day that the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. Now that's quite interesting, and we've got 50 verses, so I've got to move myself along and not get bogged down in one spot, but there's so much here already. David is writing this song to commemorate the day that the Lord finally delivered him from the hand of all of his enemies and from the hand of Saul. What does that tell us? It tells us that Saul was not considered to be David's enemy, at least by David. Now, why is that a big deal? Because Saul, who was the king before David, was trying to kill David, literally chasing him down, threatening his life, and had military men with him, and trying to eliminate David, trying to kill him. He was jealous because God had anointed him king to replace Saul. And so David was on the run for many, many years, and yet he did not consider Saul to be his enemy. He says, God's delivered me from my enemies and from the hand of Saul. He had opportunities to kill Saul and to eliminate that problem in his life, and would not do it because he believed that Saul had been chosen by God. And so he says, I'm not going to touch him. So we'll see some of that as we go through the psalm. But that's the context. So keep in mind, because that will become very, very important when we get down to a certain section a little bit further. Some of the language will go, wait a minute, that sounds so prideful. But keep in mind, the context is that David was running from his life, from Saul and Saul's men. And once that was all over, then David pens this psalm. Now, this psalm here, this section, Rescuer, begins with praise in verses 1, 2, and 3. It says in verse 1, at the end of that title there, I will love you, O Lord, my strength. So you're going to see here that 9 times, he's going to stack up 9 different titles or names for God, these characteristics, these descriptive words for God. And he begins by saying, I will love you, O Lord, my strength. Okay? So he's saying, Lord, you've been my strength. Then in verse 2, the Lord is my rock. Now, why is that? That sounds kind of funny for us, like, the Lord is my rock. What is that all about? Well, a rock obviously is something that is stable, it's strong, it's hard, it's unchanging. And he saw God that way, like, you're my firm foundation, my rock. The Lord is my rock. And my fortress, which obviously would be the picture of like a castle, a place of safety. And my deliverer. So there is where the idea of a rescuer, that picture is introduced there, my deliverer. Now keep in mind, again, the context. What's the context? He had been saved. God had protected him and saved him from being killed by Saul. So he says, you're my deliverer. My God, he says, again in verse 2, my strength. Now, he already used the word strength, and this word strength here actually is different. This word strength means fountain, source, and origin. So we have that translated as strength, but what it really means is fountain, source, and origin. So he's saying, God, you're my fountain, you're my source, you're my origin, in whom I will trust. Keeping in mind that God is strength, that he's rock, that he's a fortress, that he's a deliverer, that he is a fountain, source, and origin, it makes it easier to trust in him, in whom I will trust. So it makes sense as to why David would trust in him, and certainly it makes sense for you and I as to why we would trust in him too. He's all of these things, not only for David, but for us also. He goes on to say in verse 2 still, and here he is, he's just stacking these things up, my shield and the horn of my salvation. That my shield, obviously, that's an obvious, descriptive word. We know what a shield is and what it's used for. But the horn of my salvation, that's always kind of a little bit of a funny one or an odd one. What is that? Well, a horn was seen as a symbol of strength. Any animal that had a horn, it could have been something smaller like a ram. Those horns can be quite dangerous. I still have one of my favorite videos, personal videos, is of my son in Mexico. We had gone on a weekend trip, and we were with a group from Revival here, and they challenged us to go into the sheep pen because there was one of the rams in there, well, the only ram that was protecting the sheep. And Lisa down there was telling us, hey, a different Lisa, not our Lisa. Lisa was telling us that, I dare you to go in there. That ram is vicious. And so, of course, it was either going to be me or it was going to be my son, and he was the first one. And so he jumped in there, and this ram just immediately started to go after him, trying to ram my son. He was able to evade it, but it was just the funniest video. Every time I watch it, I just crack up. But the horn, if it's a bull, if it's an ox, whatever it might be, that horn is seen as a symbol of power. In Isaiah 5:1, that word horn is used to describe the summit of a hill. So that makes sense. It's like the hill is pointed at the top, And so that's fitting. The horn of my salvation, or the hill of my salvation, or this is the point of my salvation, is what he's saying. And then he says finally in verse 2, my stronghold, or my strong tower. Doesn't stop there though. It says in verse 3, I will call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised. There it is. That's why I called it praise in verses 1 through 3. He's naming all of these things. Who is worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from my enemies. Now, he makes the point there at the end of verse 3 to say, listen, God is all of these wonderful things. So I know based on that, he says, so, he uses the word so. So, because of all these things, so shall I be saved from my enemies. So he had experienced the goodness of God. And he was able to say, you know what? Because of all that God has done, I know that I will be saved from my enemies, future enemies. Because he had been saved from his enemies. Now, these terms are these are things that David knew personally about the Lord. And I would say to you that these are all terms that you and I may not necessarily fully understand, but we will. As you and I continue through life, we are going to experience hardships. I know that there are many of you who have experienced hardships already. And some of these things you may know already about God. That, yeah, he does save me. He's already rescued me. But as you and I continue to experience hardships in life, these things are going to become near. You're going to be able to look back and you go, you know what? No, he is my rock and he is my fortress. Now I understand what David meant by that. As it is right now, we may not know all of these. And in fact, I would go so far as to say we really cannot understand all of these things without experiencing hardship. David understood all of these things, and he was able to just kind of rattle these names and titles off because he had just come out of the hardest time that he had experienced in his life. Being chased, pretty much on the daily, having his life threatened, coming very close to death. It was a very hard time for David, but through that, he learned the faithfulness of the Lord. And so he goes on. Now, beginning at verse 4, now check this out. Beginning at verse 4 down to 48, that's a lot of verses. And we're going to read through all of them, but we do not necessarily need to stop and explain all of them. You'll see why. Many of them we can read through. But what he does at this point is he begins to give proof. I probably should have called that proofs, because what he does is he's going to list off all of the reasons why he considers God to be a rescuer, why he's praising him, why in verse 49 he says, therefore I will give thanks, and I'll sing these praises. He's got all of these verses, these 44 verses filled with reasons to believe God, to trust God, to praise God. Now, he begins in verse 4 with this, and we've got some sub points here. Verses 4 to 19, he said, listen, he's a rescuer because he rescued me from death. He had rescued him from death. Verse 4, the pangs of death, or the pains of death. surrounded me. So every day as he's running from Saul, he's surrounded by death. And the floods of ungodliness made me afraid. Now, I love the Psalms, and it is normal for me, being a pastor, to every so often go on hospital visits or home visits when people are facing, when they've got cancer or leukemia, when they've got some, terrible sickness or disease going on. I've got to show up and do my best to give some comfort, some hope. And I love going to the Psalms, because it's filled by David and the other writers. It's filled with emotion. And you just get the highs and the lows. This is a wonderful psalm, but there are some psalms where David is just going, oh, Lord, you get the sense of David just going, oh, Lord, you really have just blown it, man. I'm at the lowest, and all the wicked people are at the highest, and I just don't really understand. And then in the same psalm, he turns it around and he goes, oh, Lord, forgive me, and, you're the greatest, and I'm not at the lowest. And he's got all of these emotions flowing. All of these emotions, you might say that he's in his feelings. I mean, you just, as you read it, you get it in every psalm. And here, he has no problem saying that he was afraid. The floods of ungodliness. Now, you're getting the poetry here. There was not really a flood of ungodliness, but you understand he's using that to describe the ungodliness that surrounded him. And he says, it made me afraid. Verse 5, the sorrows of Sheol. That would be the Old Testament equivalent of death or maybe even hell, the afterlife. The sorrows of the grave, we might say, surrounded me. The snares, the traps of death confronted me. In my distress. You see all of this? He says, I was afraid. I was in distress. Sometimes we get this idea that because we're Christians, that we shouldn't ever be afraid, or that we should never sorrow, or we should never be in distress. And we might be able to make the argument that we shouldn't be, but the fact is that there are many times in life where we do experience sorrow and fear and distress. And you may feel like, oh, I'm just the worst Christian ever because I'm afraid or because I'm in distress. Well, David experienced those same things, and he's telling us here plainly. He says in verse 6, in my distress, I called upon the Lord and cried out to my God. And he heard my voice from his temple. Now, pay attention to how many times he uses the word he as we go through these next several verses. He heard my voice from his temple. What temple? His heavenly temple, where God was dwelling. He says, he heard my voice from his temple, and my cry came before him, even to his ears. Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations of the hills also quaked and were shaken, because he was angry. Now, whether David actually experienced some of these, what we might call natural phenomena or things that were happening in nature, that we do not know, or whether David is being poetic, but these are all things that we know God can do. He can shake the foundations of the earth. The earth is his. He can do what he wants with it. But he's describing that he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord heard and began to come to his rescue. Verse 7, the earth shook and trembled. The foundations of the hills also quaked and were shaken, because he was angry. Why was God angry? Because David was in trouble. Because David needed rescue. Because David belonged to God, and God was on his way to come and rescue him. So he would have been angry at the enemies of David. Verse 8, smoke went up from his nostrils. Now again, poetic, because God doesn't have ears and he doesn't have nostrils. Some people get this picture that, oh man, God, he's big, so he must have some really big ears. Or, he can hear all of us praying throughout the world all at one time. He must have some really big ears. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. That's what Jesus told us. So he doesn't have ears, and he doesn't have, this big nose with all of this smoke coming out of it. But David is describing, his rescuer and God being angry. Verse 8, smoke went up from his nostrils, and devouring fire from his mouth. Even coals were kindled by it. Verse 9, he, there we go again, the focus being on God, he bowed the heavens also and came down with darkness under his feet. And he rode upon a cherub. Now, the idea of darkness under his feet, this is language to describe the terrifying approach of God. Smoke from his nostrils, fire from his mouth. He bowed the heavens down. He came down. Darkness was under his feet. Verse 10, and he rode upon a cherub. That would be an angelic being. He rode upon an angel and flew. He flew upon the wings of the wind. Fitting, because it was so windy today this morning. But he flew upon the wings of the wind. He made darkness his secret place. That's terrifying. Again, the darkness, right? I've described it for you before. You already know, you might think that, oh man, am I the only one that's afraid of the dark? No. Like when you forget to take out the trash, mom or dad told you at like 3 in the afternoon, and you didn't do it because you were right in the middle of the most important game of your life. And you just needed to get to the boss level, and I just need to pass this one last level. And so you didn't do it. And you waited too long, and now the time changed, and now the sun's down. And now I've got to take the trash outside, around the corner of the house, over on the side of the trash, where the trash cans are stored. And you know what's over there. Could be a killer rat. It could be some axe murderer in a hockey mask with, blood and fangs and whatever else. Or there's something on the roof waiting to jump on you, or something in the tree, or, some demonic dog out there. All the thoughts that swirl through your mind, and I can see you laughing because these are all things that you think about. You have to go and you kind of look around the corner. It's like, man, it's so dark. Why hasn't Dad put lights out here yet, But you got to do it. Darkness can be terrifying. And so he's using it to describe here. Verse 11, he made darkness his secret place. His canopy around him was dark waters and thick clouds of the skies. Terrifying scene. From the brightness before him, his thick clouds passed with hailstones and coals of fire. The Lord thundered from heaven. And the Most High, that's still God, that's another title, another descriptive phrase, and the Most High uttered his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. You understand the picture he's painting here? David has an earthly issue, an earthly problem. He's being chased here on earth. And he's calling out to God, who's the Most High, who's up in heaven, above everything. And what we get here is this picture of God. We would use the phrase, moving heaven and earth. And he sees God moving heaven and earth to come to his rescue. What a beautiful picture. And the darkness and all of that, that's not something that was meant for David. That's something that was meant for his enemies to see, that God was terrifying. God was coming down and, was going to have vengeance and protect David. That's what he was doing. He was coming to rescue David. Hailstones and coals of fire and thunder from heaven, all of this, moving heaven and earth. Verse 14, he sent out his arrows and scattered the foe. Lightnings in abundance. And he vanquished them. He eliminated them, got rid of them. Then in verse 15, the channels of the sea were seen. The fountains of the world were uncovered. At your rebuke. Now, he's been talking. Notice how the language changes. He's been talking about God. Although we were told he spoke these things to the Lord, he's describing God, but now he actually turns his attention right at God. And he says in the middle of verse 15, at your rebuke. So now he's talking directly to the Lord. At your rebuke, at your correction, O Lord, at the blast of the breath of your nostrils. So it's this terrifying picture of God coming and looking for the enemies of David, and seeking to have vengeance and protection and to protect and rescue David. Verse 15. I'm sorry. Oh, yes, verse 15 actually. Then the channels of the sea were seen. In other words, the foundations of the world were uncovered. He's just saying that it was everything was open. Everything was exposed. Verse 16. He sent from above. He took me. He drew me out of many waters. There it is. He rescued him. He sent from above. He took me. He drew me out of many waters, the waters that he was drowning in. He delivered me in verse 17 from my strong enemy. David has no problem saying, yeah, my enemy was strong. Had me scared, had me terrified, had me in distress. He delivered me from my strong enemy, from those who hated me, for they were too strong for me. You know, in order to enlist help from the Lord, you have to be willing to admit to God that you need help. You have to be willing to admit to God that you are fearful, that you're terrified, and that only God can rescue you. And David here, now, this is so fascinating to me because, again, many of us know about the life of David. And, whenever we talk about David, there's probably two events that we all think of. The first being David and Goliath. And secondly, David and Bathsheba. So a great victory and a great fail. But that first one, the great victory, when David is just a boy, really, and he shows up and he hears Goliath out there insulting Israel and shaming God, and he asks the question, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? Who is this nothing of a man out here? Who is this? And he takes the stone and he puts it into his sling and swings it, and the stone hits Goliath so hard in the skull that it actually sinks into his skull, and he dropped dead. And then he doesn't stop there. He takes the sword and cuts Goliath's head off. Incredible. So you would think that David wasn't scared of anyone or anything. And yet he admits here, I was terrified. God had to come to my rescue. Verse 17, they were too strong for me. It's like, what? But you killed Goliath. What are you talking about? Yeah, but this time there were too many. They had him on the run. Verse 18, they confronted me in the day of my calamity, in the midst of my chaos, man, when his heart was troubled, his mind was troubled, but the Lord was my support. What a wonderful verse. Because it seems for you and I oftentimes that things come in seasons, man. They come in pairs. Like when I'm experiencing a hardship, it just seems like Satan gets in there and he's just trying to kick me while I'm down. And several things are going wrong all at once. So he describes it there in verse 18. They confronted me in the day of my calamity, man. They came in the midst of my trouble. But the Lord was my support. And then in verse 19, he also brought me out into a broad place. He delivered me because he delighted in me. Now I want you to notice, how many times did he use the word he? This is important because of the next section that we get into. In verse 6, he heard my voice. In verse 9, he bowed down the heavens. Verse 10, he rode upon a cherub. He flew upon the wings of the wind. Verse 11, he made darkness a secret place. Down in verse 14, he sent out his arrows. He vanquished them. In verse 16, he sent from above. He took me. He drew me. Verse 17, he delivered me. In verse 19, he also brought me. He delivered me. He delighted in me. So he makes it very clear that God was the one doing all of this. Do you understand that? Is that clear? It was God who was doing all of this. Now that's important. That coupled together with the context of this psalm. Remember what the context was? Yeah, remember what the context was? He was running from Saul and Saul's men. And I will preface the next section that we get into, which is being rewarded because of his faithfulness. God rewarded his faithfulness. I will preface this with saying the context was what? That David had been running from Saul and his men. David had opportunities to kill Saul. One of my favorites was when Saul went into a cave to go to the potty. Took a potty break while he was in the midst of chasing David. Went into a cave. Just so happens that David and his men were inside the cave already. And David snuck up behind him while he was doing his business. Whew. And he cut a piece of his robe off, just cut off a corner. That's how sneaky and slick David was. And then after Saul left the cave, David comes out. There's some distance in between them, and he goes, "Hey, Saul, you know me, I'm your servant, man. I love you. I'm not trying to kill you." And he showed him. He goes, "Look what you came into the cave, and look what happened. I could have killed you. I was close enough to cut off a piece of your garment. I could have killed you, but I didn't." So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. And the fact that God was the one who did all of this, because if you don't keep that in mind, then verses 20 through 28 seem prideful. But I'll explain. Verse 20. The Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands. He has recompensed me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord, and have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his judgments were before me, and I did not put away his statutes from me, his rules, his laws. I was also blameless before him, and I kept myself from my iniquity. That's my sin. It was mine, he says. I kept it. I kept myself away from it. Verse 24, therefore, the Lord has recompensed me. He's rewarded me. He's paid me back. According to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands in his sight. Now we'll get into verses 25 through 28 in just a moment, but some of those verses sound prideful. It sounds like, well, David is saying that he got rewarded because he did all of these great things. But that obviously cannot be the case, because we just read for several verses, I believe he used the word he 14 times prior to this. So it's clear that David knows that God did all the work. So he's clearly not saying, well, I was really great, and that's why God came to save me. That's why God rescued me. That's not what he's saying here. And the fact that we know that he was running from Saul, what is he saying in these verses? Why do they sound prideful? Well, they sound prideful, but they're not. What he's explaining, and please understand, this was in between Goliath and Bathsheba. Yes, he sinned greatly with Bathsheba. And it wasn't the only time that he sinned. He was a sinner. But this is in between that time. So he hadn't sinned with Bathsheba yet when all of this was going on. These things that he's writing about. But understand what he's saying, what David is saying is that he could have killed Saul. He had opportunities to do that. But he didn't. Instead, what he did was he obeyed God. He trusted God. He wasn't living or acting or reacting the way that Saul and his men were. So compared to Saul and Saul's men, David's enemies, he says, compared to them, I held fast to you, Lord. I trusted you. I could have killed them, but I didn't, because I trusted you. And I held on to your statutes, your rules, your laws, your commands. So that's what he's saying in these verses. And he's saying that because he trusted the Lord, God rewarded him for that. See, if David had responded the way that, in like manner, like Saul and like the men that were with Saul, had David taken this problem into his own hands, then he would have done just that. He would have taken it out of the hands of God, and he would have handled it. And then there might have been some discipline from the Lord in David's life. Because, hey, you're living in disobedience. I didn't tell you to attack Saul. I didn't tell you to take vengeance on him. I told you to trust me. Why would you do that? But David didn't do that. Instead, he trusted the Lord. And so what he's explaining here is that God is such a good rescuer. Because I was obedient to him. I listened to him. I waited for him. I trusted in him. And he's rewarded me for that. He's repaid me for that. And so that's what David is saying. David knows and knew, and of course found out even more so, that he had no righteousness of his own. When he says in verse 24, according to my righteousness, what he's saying is the right way that I responded to this situation. I trusted you, Lord. I didn't take it into my own hands. What a wonderful lesson for you and I to understand that we need to make sure we're trusting God with the difficulties in our lives too. And not taking it into our own hands, but committing it to the Lord and trusting him. Now, he goes on here, beginning at verse 29, to tell us that God is a good rescuer. Can we get it up there? Where's it at? Is it coming? Where's it at? Someone want to help me out back there? From verse 29 down to verse 48, he tells us that God is a good rescuer because he reinforced his confidence. Reinforced his confidence. Thank you very much for that. At verse 29, he says, for by you, it was you, God, I can run against a troop. But my God, by my God, I can leap over a wall. See, he's got confidence. Because of what he's seen God do, he knows what can happen. Verse 30, as for God, his way is, I love this verse, verse 30. As for God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord is proven. He is a shield to all who trust in him. Verse 31, for who is God except the Lord? And who is a rock except our God? It is God who arms me with strength and makes my way perfect. He makes my feet like the feet of deer. You ever seen deer run? They're nimble. Jump over things. They can stand on tiny little ledges and rocks and not fall. It's incredible. Verse 33, and sets me on high places. He teaches my hands to make war. What a verse. He teaches my hands to make war so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. Bend a bow of bronze. Say that 3 times fast. Bend a bow of bronze. What is that? What is he saying? Well, a bow of bronze. Bronze would have been a strong metal. Imagine trying to bend. Some of you have a bow and arrow. Imagine trying to bend a bow made out of bronze. You're like, how am I supposed to bend this thing? Well, that's the point. It's poetic. He's saying, even a bow of bronze, man, I had so much strength from the Lord that I was able to bend it. So he's saying, he's describing that the Lord had strengthened him. And then in verse 35, you have also given me the shield of your salvation. Your right hand has held me up. Your gentleness has made me great. His gentleness. You enlarged my path under my feet. In other words, you made the path wider so my feet did not slip. I have pursued my enemies and overtaken them. Neither did I turn back again till they were destroyed. I have wounded them so that they could not rise. They have fallen under my feet. For you have armed me with strength for the battle. You have subdued under me those who rose up against me. You have also given me the necks of my enemies, so that I destroyed those who hated me. They cried out in verse 41, but there was none to save. He says, even to the Lord. They even cried out to the Lord, but he did not answer them. Why would he not answer them? I thought he said everybody that calls on the Lord. Well, obviously, these would have been individuals that called on the Lord, but didn't belong. They didn't belong to the Lord. So God wasn't coming to their rescue. Verse 42, then I beat them as fine as the dust before the wind. I cast them out like dirt in the streets. You have delivered me from the strivings of the people. You understand? He mentioned those things again. This is what I did. This is what I did. This is what I did. But the point that he's making is I was able to do this because of God. Verse 43, you have delivered me from the strivings of the people. You have made me the head of the nations. There it is. He says, you made me the king, the head of the nations. A people I have not known shall serve me. Verse 44, as soon as they hear of me, they obey me. The foreigners, even his people who are not his own people, they submit to him. The foreigners fade away and come frightened from their hideouts. The Lord lives. Blessed be my rock. Let the God of my salvation be exalted. It is God who avenges me and subdues the peoples under me. He delivers me from my enemies. You also lift me up above those who rise against me. You have delivered me from the violent man. And finally, the last 2 verses, which obviously are a different division, verses 49 and 50, are the result. So what about this? All wonderful things. And these are things that are true for you and I. God has rescued us out of dangerous places. Some of you have been in near accidents, or maybe you've been in an accident. But maybe you've had near-death experiences. Whether it be an accident or an almost near accident, you think, man, I could have died. Something could have happened to me. but God rescued you. Well, in verses 49 and 50, really in verse 49, we get our last 2 points, the result. The first is that because of this, he gives thanks. Notice the word therefore in verse 49. Therefore, because of all of this, I will give thanks to you. There it is. I'm going to give thanks. As I head toward our holiday, our American holiday, Thanksgiving, what do I have to be thankful for? Well, I can be thankful that the Lord has protected me all of this time. Therefore, I will give thanks to you, O Lord, he says, among the Gentiles. So he's even going to praise God among those people that didn't belong to God. And then secondly, the second thing he's going to do is he's going to sing praises in verse 49. And sing praises to your name. You see, that's one of the reasons that we always have worship. For all of the good things that God has done. For all of the goodness that he's shown us. The protection. Keeping us safe from our enemies. So we want to give thanks and sing praises to your name. And then finally in verse 50, great deliverance he gives to his king. There it is. David. And shows mercy to his anointed. That's David again. He was anointed by God. To David and his descendants forevermore. And that's just what God has done. He's blessed David and the family of David and the lineage of David. What a wonderful song. And what wonderful reasons to be, reasons that we have to be reminded that God is to be thanked for all that he's done. Now again, some of you may not have experienced great difficulties yet in life. Some of you have, but many of us have not. But these are one of these things or this psalm is one of those psalms that you want to hold on to because the difficult times will come. And you may find yourself in a hospital. It might be you or it might be a loved one that's in the hospital and you're visiting and experiencing the excruciating pain of sickness or maybe even death. And who are you going to trust in? We want to trust in the Lord. We want him to do the fighting for us, to give us the strength, to be our strength, to be our strong tower. These are reasons to give thanks to the Lord. Father, we are so very thankful for this passage.